current generation seems to be learning things more from X and Instagram and Facebook. And that's worrying because these are sound bites. Sound bites can give you impressions. They can't give you deep knowledge. When you need any services in India and abroad, whether you lost your passport or you're a student in trouble or a student dies, is to contact the nearest Indian consulate or embassy.
India has neighbors like China, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Tibet, etc. Who's a threat to us?
No, nobody is a threat to us. We are too big to be threatened by anybody. Too long we obsessed with Pakistan. What is Pakistan?
The gap between our urgent needs and available resources is increasing by the day.
It's a relatively smaller country with an economy 1/10 our size and has barely been able to maintain unity in the last 75 years. So we should not waste our breath on Pakistan. Why China has spectacularly developed over the past 30 years. That it was very easy for China to do so because it is a dictatorship.
China is engaged in a whole-of-state effort to become the world's only superpower by any means necessary.
Namaste and welcome to this episode of the OddCast Show. Today on the show, we are joined by Vijay Gokhale ji, the former Foreign Secretary to the Indian government. He is also a leading sinologist from India, as well as served as ambassador to China and Germany. Welcome to the show, sir. Namaskar.
Thank you.
How are you doing today?
Very well, thank you.
We're very excited to have you today because, we've got so many questions based on our foreign policy, etc. But I want to start with something more generic. Generally, typically, people in India have the opinion that, bureaucracy, it's something that, holds us back, or it, stems our flow, and, it doesn't let get work done, red tapeism, etc. and all that. What's your view on this, sir?
Well, I think we have to acknowledge that any government requires a staff to implement policy. We elect our leaders. We've just done it last week. And they bring new policies to the table, but somebody has to do the work of actually putting that policy on the ground. And that is essentially what the bureaucracy is meant to do. Now, in India, as you know, the bureaucracy is, in a sense, inherited from the British Empire.
Right.
And therefore, a lot of the laws and regulations that guided bureaucracy were laws and regulations made during the British era. To some extent, these need to be changed because ultimately the requirements of today, when we are a free country, are different from the requirements when we are being governed by a foreign power. And over the period of the last 70 years, all governments, including the current government, have made changes to these laws and regulations. The idea being the bureaucracy should become more sensitive to the people's requirements.
Right.
Now, as in any institution, whether it is private sector or government, there will be people who work, and then there are people who, for want of a better word, we can call freeloaders.
Right.
Ours is no different. But to discredit the entire bureaucracy is like throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because theoretically, if you don't have a bureaucracy, then which other institution is going to actually deliver the promises made by the political leadership to the people of India?
Right.
So much as we may dislike bureaucracy, I think there is a certain functionality to it. There is a certain requirement for it. The work of the leadership is to ensure that the bureaucracy delivers. The work of parliament is to legislate so that the bureaucracy does what it is meant to do. And I think ultimately it depends on the leadership within the bureaucracy also to ensure that institutions deliver particularly when you're heading a bureaucratic setup. So what I want to say is, I think by and large, at least the senior bureaucracy in India is very patriotic and fairly goal-oriented. And I think the government does a good job of generally getting work done from the bureaucracy. But sometimes the bureaucracy does tend to become rule-bound or regulation-bound, and then the public suffers for it. I think it's important that reforms continue in the bureaucracy so that it becomes more service-oriented, public service-oriented, rather than regulation-bound. And there I'm ready to admit that we need to make further changes in the bureaucracy, in the way it functions, in the selection procedure, in the promotion procedure as well. Hopefully, the government will look into all these matters. If you see the way the current government has functioned, for instance, they've done a number of changes. We've just changed the criminal procedure code and the civil procedure code, which predated independence.
Wow.
The government has also introduced lateral entry into the bureaucracy. In other words, you bring in highly professionally qualified people at senior levels to try and bring a new work culture. They're trying various other things as well. Let's see how it goes.
But so you mentioned that we are being governed. The bureaucracy is being run on principles, rules, regulations, which have been pre-colonization era since it's been going on since then. And the Brits put these rules and regulations in which we were following. Then you mentioned that from the last 75 years we've been going through changes. Every government has made certain changes and reforms.
Right.
How far are we from having a perfect system? I mean, where are we in those?
Well, there is no such thing as a perfect bureaucracy, frankly speaking. But I think the bureaucracy has been fairly successful in the maintenance of law and order and stability in the country.
Right.
Ultimately, we have to acknowledge that 75 years after independence, we've had 15 general elections. The last one concluded very successfully last week. We have had multiple changes of government. Various political parties have come and gone, but the nation has remained stable. And that is also because of the strong bureaucracy we have. So we have to give credit where it is due.
Absolutely.
Where we need reform is that the bureaucracy is seen by many, and perhaps this is also true, it does not respond to public requirements or the needs of the public. And if you recall the time when you and I were growing up, it was difficult to get a gas connection.
Right.
To get a telephone took you 2 or 3 years. You had to book a Maruti car well in advance.
Open a bank account.
The service I come from, the Indian Foreign Service, passports would take several months to come. There's no doubt there's a change in all these areas.
Absolutely.
And that is because the bureaucracy has increasingly become public-oriented. But I don't think we are still right where we should be. There are a number of complaints very legitimately from the public that when they go to government offices, the work doesn't get done immediately, or the procedures are complicated, or you are told at the last minute a rule has changed. And this requires us to become much more public friendly. Now, one big initiative the government has taken, the current government, is e-governance. And there, I think a considerable degree of improvement has taken place. And let me share a personal example. My PAN card was 25 years old. The photograph had no bearing with what I look now. And they had also introduced the QR code, which I didn't have on my PAN card. So I applied for a new PAN card. And ordinarily, it would have taken weeks, and you would never have known when it would come. This time, I not only was getting SMSs on the process, but after it was dispatched, I got SMSs saying where it had reached, when it would be delivered, and which courier agency was delivering it. So this, in a sense, is responding to public requirements and needs for information and for easy access to services.
Right.
If this trend continues, and I have no doubt that the current government intends to make public services more and more accessible, we will get a better and better bureaucracy.
Right.
But as I said, there is no such thing as a perfect bureaucracy. There will be inefficiency. Unfortunately, there will be corruption. We will have to deal with that. And hopefully, the laws that we make will minimize. I don't think we can ever eliminate inefficiency and corruption, but let's at least try to minimize it.
Sure, that's great. So the other thing I wanted to ask you is that since you've served as ambassador to China for so many years, as well as you're a sinologist, what's your view on China?
Oh, I have many views on China. We can talk for an entire session on that. But I think the first thing I want to say is we don't have enough information on China as Indians. And that is a very unfortunate thing, because China is a very large neighbor with whom we have a very complex relationship.
Right.
Now, there is some excellent work on China done by Western academics, institutions, and universities. But these are from a Western perspective. Why would an academic sitting at Stanford or Berkeley or Harvard write from an Indian perspective? He is writing for an American audience with an American perspective, and that is not our perspective. There is a lot of good work coming out of China, but that too is from a very narrow Chinese perspective. The point I'm trying to make is we don't have an Indian perspective of China. And one of the reasons after I completed public service in writing 4 books on China is to try and at least start the process of having an Indian view on China. So I think firstly, we need to have a good view on China. Secondly, we need to avoid a simplistic explanation of why China has spectacularly developed over the past 30 years. Very often I am told by others that it was very easy for China to do so because it is a dictatorship.
Right.
So it can, if it decides to build a bridge or a road, all it has to do is knock down the houses and nobody is going to say anything.
Asked.
That's a very naive explanation. There is public opinion in China as well. No government, however autocratic or dictatorial, can simply proceed without public opinion and without public support. So we have to look for other explanations. And the other explanations essentially center on how the politics of the country was conducted. They decentralized power. Power flowed out from Beijing to the provinces. And the provinces were told, your priority is economic development. You go and do what is necessary for development. And as a result, there was competition between the provinces, what we call states in India, as to how to attract talent, investment, and technology. That was one big driver of change. The second was a relative openness in what is otherwise a very closed communist system, which allowed for a lot of free thinking and exchange of ideas and innovation. So you had a lot of Chinese students going to the United States after 1980. You had a lot of foreign nationals also coming to China. And you had a lot of exchanges which allowed for innovation. Today, if China is a world leader in technology, and there is no doubt that China is a leader in technology, it is because of this. So we have to give credit to the leadership for some very sound policies on the economic and social side. There is a lot of criticism you can make about China on the political, economic, and political, social, and other sides. But on the economic side, you have to give very great credit to the Chinese, which is why China today is a very formidable economic and scientific power. On the negative side of the ledger, of course, is the fact that it is a one-party system. It's never tested its popularity.
Right.
When the Chinese Communist Party tells you that the people support it, then it begs the question, if the people like you so much, why don't you put it to the vote?
Right.
So whatever you say about the Indian system, it has proved its superiority in terms of a very stable, reliable, predictable system. And, very often people say, India is unstable. That's a very unusual statement to me, because political stability is defined by how you govern a country in a transition period. When power changes hands, is there inherent instability which threatens your personal safety, your property, your welfare, and the nation? And the answer clearly is no. Governments have come and gone. We have not, our safety has not been attacked. Our daily life is not attacked. Our property is safe. Our businesses are safe. So social stability is maintained. In the case of China, that has not been tested.
Right.
And recent incidents, whether the 1989 Tiananmen incident is taken or the recent COVID incidents where the COVID policy catastrophically collapsed, shows you that they are not capable of handling great social stress or great instability. So on the negative side of the ledger, I would say China has to be tested on its politics.
Right.
And we should not presume, particularly businesses should not presume that they can go on doing business with China and will continue to grow. And they have to also plan for disruptions in the global supply chain. So I would say to sum it up, it's a country which is vitally important to us, whichever way you look at it, politically, militarily, diplomatically, socially, geopolitically.
Right.
We need to learn more about it. There are qualities to be admired. At the same time, there are weaknesses in the system we need to study.
And learn from.
Right.
So, you mentioned that our relationship with China has been complex. Why is it complex? What can we do to resolve this or make it simple?
Well, ultimately, it is complex because we are the two largest countries in the Indo-Pacific, if you don't count the United States,
Right.
because it is actually on the American continent.
Right.
Although it is an Indo-Pacific power. We are the two largest countries in terms of territory, in terms of population, and very soon will be in terms of economy, because we are close to overtaking Japan in the next 4 to 5 years.
Right.
And therefore, then we will become, after China, the second largest economy. To some extent, therefore, there is competition, because both countries are civilizational countries. We have survived for thousands of years, and we have influenced events beyond our territorial boundaries also for thousands of years.
Right.
I mean, many Indians do not understand how great Indian influence has been in history. If you look at names of Southeast Asian countries, Cambodia, from the word Cambodge, Singapore, from the word Singapura, Malaya, from the Sanskrit word Malay, which is hills. If you look at languages, the language of Malaysia is called Bahasa Malay. The script, much of the language of Thailand or Laos has evolved from Prakrit and Pali. If you look at dance, if you look at names, I mean, if you look at Indonesian names, they are most of the Muslim.
Yeah.
But if you look at the names, Meghavati Sukarno Putri,
Yeah.
or the current president or the previous president, all are very Sanskritized names.
Right.
So Indian influence has been big. Chinese influence has also been big through history. And therefore, there is a geopolitical competition which is natural between two major powers. And that makes it complex. But in addition to that, there have been certain policies adopted by both sides which have added to that complexity. The boundary question, for example, or the border dispute is one. And then there are certain events which have occurred which were not necessarily something which India may have would have done, but which we have been compelled to deal with, such as the Dalai Lama fleeing from China in 1959 and coming to reside in India.
Right.
So for a variety of reasons, some are geopolitical, some are because of the policies of the government, some are these events which you have no control over. It's a very complex relationship.
Right.
And you need to exercise diplomacy to handle it. And diplomacy has got two faces, as you know. There's a military side to diplomacy and there's a negotiating side. So there are two faces of the same coin. War and peace are two faces of the same coin. And you use it to manage that relationship. And I think that's what we are doing. We are managing that relationship.
Right. But so you mentioned that, China, there's very little we know about China. And typically also as an average citizen of India, we barely get to hear anything coming out of China because a lot of it is state controlled. Now, a question that I have is that how do they treat their minorities? Since you were there as ambassador, you must have seen stuff. So what's your experience on that?
Yeah, well, that has been an evolving process, because when the communists took power in 1949, traditionally communism as an ideology does not believe in religion or spirituality.
Right.
I mean, you recall the famous words of Karl Marx that religion is the opium of the masses.
Right.
In other words, it was being fed by the upper classes to the lower classes to keep them subdued and subordinate. And so essentially what Mao Zedong did was he virtually launched a war against religions, which is, first of all, physically in many cases destroying temples, mosques. By temples, I mean Buddhist temples. There are no Hindus there. Buddhist temples, mosques, churches. Secondly, by, in a sense, nationalizing the clergy. In other words, that the Vatican had no role in appointing bishops. The imams in mosques or the monks in Buddhist temples had to be trained in Chinese religious colleges and were expected to serve the interests of the Communist Party. And in general, populations were discouraged from going to pray.
Right.
But over time, the communists in China realized, as much of the rest of the world realizes, that you can't substitute spiritualism or the need for people to have some kind of an emotional link with money or with some other inducement, status, money, or a more comfortable life, and so on, or education.
People still want that.
Yes, you still need a spiritual anchor. So what we have seen in China from 1980 is a relative relaxation in religion, so that now you can actually pray in temples, you can follow religious practices, and so on. I'm saying this because a lot of religion, the religion in China is driven in the minority areas. The majority Han population, the ethnicity is called Han, and 95% of Chinese are Han. They have generally been relatively irreligious through history.
Okay.
They have had their own religions like Taoism or Confucianism, but these are more a way of life than very strict religion in the way that we all understand religion.
Right.
So most of the religious traditions have come from abroad. Buddhism essentially from India, Islam from the Turkish Central Asia, and Christianity from Europe. And these have taken root. And in the bordering regions where the minorities live, they have taken a stronger root. So you have Tibet, which is largely Buddhist.
Right.
You have Xinjiang, Gansu, and Qinghai provinces, which are largely Islamic because Turkish influence came there. And then you have borderland areas of the East Coast where Christianity came about. Right. Now, the problem is that there is always a struggle in China between how far you can allow religion to go and the influence it will have on the minorities, which will then start demanding separate status.
Right.
Initially autonomy and then independence.
Right.
And so this struggle plays out in China. They understand the need to liberalize their control on religion. But they feel that when it is liberalized, these populations get restive and start talking of independence, particularly the Islamic provinces of China, as well as Tibet. Now, in their own minds, they see this as some kind of a subversion of the system. And then it gets linked with the fact that these are not Chinese religions. And therefore, outsiders are subverting the system. That adds to the sense of paranoia that the Communist Party has. So therefore, you see this hot and cold approach towards their minorities, including efforts to change their language, to promote Chinese rather than Tibetan, to control their religious practices. For instance, you have to have the imams have to be certified by the state. Certain religious texts cannot be taught. Certain religious names cannot be used. No contact or donation or preaching or teaching can come from outside. Things which in India are not acceptable because we are a free and open society, and provided there is no subversion of the state by religion, as we did see, for instance, in the Punjab, where it was clearly an effort to subvert the state in which the government acted. Government has generally been fairly hands-off on this issue.
Right.
And so this is the difference between India and China. Democracy functions differently. It allows people to practice faith and religion within the broad limits of the law. You obviously can't do something religious which is going to hurt or kill others.
Right.
But other than that, you're free to practice, right? In India, it's not the case in China because the fear of the state is that religion will undermine the Communist Party there.
Right. But so another question I had about China is that of late in the last 5-7 years, we've been hearing a lot of, snippets in the news that, there's a lot of Chinese aggression on our borders. Why would they, is that true? Is that really happening on the ground? Because there's so much of mixed information and so much of misinformation on the topic itself by our own media, by Western media like WAPO, etc., New York Times. There's always articles planted, to further complicate the situation. So what's the real deal over there?
Well, the real deal is that as part of the effort to keep India relatively subdued or in a subordinate position. In what they see is a geopolitical rivalry between these two countries going ahead for the rest of the century. One way of doing so is to maintain a sense of physical insecurity for India on the border, to heighten that sense of physical insecurity, and the resultant cost that we are going to pay in financial terms. It's very expensive to keep troops at those heights on the border in those numbers. So it's financially expensive. It takes a toll on the human being also and on equipment also. So it's called gray zone warfare. Or these days the term is military operations other than war. In other words, you're not fighting, but you are taking steps which create physical anxiety or insecurity on the other side, such that you tie up their forces, their money, and everything else, right? So this is what China is doing. And it has been steadily sort of accelerating or increasing the extent to which it is engaging in this. So you see a series of incidents on the border after 2013. But essentially what the government of India has done is it has now adapted to dealing with this situation by redefining the concept of strategic patience. In other words, of saying there is a limit to what we will tolerate before we react or respond. And the more China builds pressure, the more that threshold of tolerance is declining. In other words, what we might have accepted 60 or 70 years ago, we are no longer prepared to accept, which is why you see friction on the border. So in a sense, I do understand that Indian citizens are anxious about it, but it is in a sense a counter response we are making to Chinese attempts to maintain grey zone warfare pressure on us. Now, I, of course, have been out of government for 5 years, so I really don't know the details of what is happening and what each side is doing. But what I can say is that if you see the last 3 or 4 years where we have maintained a strong posture on the border, I can confidently say that we should be able to hold our own there.
Right.
Now, that doesn't mean the border problem will get solved. And until the border problem gets solved, it is very expensive for us, because I'm sure we can use the money we are using to defend our border much better to benefit the welfare of our citizens. But we don't have an option at this point.
But so won't it be expensive for China also? I mean, it's equally draining on both countries, right?
No, it's not equally draining on both countries, simply because our GDP is $4 trillion and China's GDP is $18 trillion. See, there is a huge economic differential. Right. We need to make up on that front. The stronger we get economically, the greater the resources you devote to defense, and the more unlikely it becomes that China can use this against you.
Okay.
The greater the economic differential, the easier and less expensive it is to China to create problems for you on the border, and the more difficult and expensive it becomes for you to counter it.
Right.
So the key is economic development.
Right. So I want to just draw a parallel, because you've served as ambassador to Germany also, and you've also served as ambassador to China. Now, China, as we know, what you mentioned is that it's more like a closed door system where, the government is controlling everything. There is a communist government in place, whereas in Germany, there's a democratic government in place. Now, there they've come out with the open door policy for immigration, whereas China is more or less open and shut. Like, they don't allow anyone of that sort to come in. But we are seeing mass immigrations happening in Europe from various countries towards these westernized, Western Europe countries. What's your view on that? Is that a right policy to have? How is the general local population taking this?
Yeah, well, first of all, you can't compare Germany and China, because in general, civilizations in the Far East have not been immigration-friendly civilizations through history.
Okay.
It's not just China. Look at Korea and look at Japan as well. These are societies which are relatively insular. From historical times, the Great Wall of China was essentially built to keep the immigrant from coming in.
Correct.
So you can't strictly compare Europe and China. Where Europe is concerned, of course, a lot of it is defined by their history. First of all, the history of colonialism, where the colonized people also emigrated in certain numbers and became citizens of those countries. So a lot of South Asians, what was the Indian subcontinent or the British Indian Empire, a number of people went and are now British citizens. The same with the French, Algerians, Moroccans, Tunisians, Angola, and so on went there. Same with the Portuguese, right? So one is that to a certain extent, colonialism over a period of 200 years created a certain space for immigrants. Secondly, the two world wars, particularly the Second World War, which was based on the Germans talking of an exclusive master race.
Right.
And the defeat of that ideology led to the Europeans accommodating different nationalities and different ethnicities. In other words, it was no longer acceptable to say that France is defined by a white Protestant citizen, and that if you happen to be a brown Hindu or a black Muslim, you can't be French. That definition was no longer politically acceptable in Europe after the defeat of Germany in the Second World War, so that created some space. The third is the economic reality. I mean, there are no people to work anymore there. The demographics are rapidly falling all over Europe. So you either accept that your economy will slow down, or you bring in the immigrant to do your work, whether it is the blue collar worker or the white collar worker. So all these three have led to immigration. Now, to answer your question, it's very interesting because I think there is a reaction taking place to immigration even in Europe.
Right.
And that is because you bring in people to do work for you because you have moved on to a higher level of work. But you don't want them to join your society and to start making changes in that society, because democracy is a game of numbers.
Right.
And therefore, if you have 10 to 15% of the vote share, you can make a difference. So today what is happening is the second generation of immigrant who looks at herself or himself as French or German, but who could be Algerian or Turkish or Muslim or Buddhist or Hindu, is voting according to their cultural traits,
Right.
which may not be the mainstream trait in Germany or France. And to that extent, I think those societies are feeling threatened, or segments of those societies are feeling threatened, or don't know how to accommodate this situation. See, in India, we don't understand this because we have for centuries been an immigrant-friendly country.
Right.
So we are quite used to dealing with a mosque standing next to a temple. Let me put it that way. For Europe, it's alien. Suddenly a mosque comes up next to a church, or you start, praying in a factory where, the majority population is Christian. Or somebody objects to the serving of pork, whereas in Germany, pork is staple diet. These are not situations they are used to dealing with. And this is creating a reaction. We are used to dealing with this situation.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
So we don't think twice about it. We don't realize that tolerance is actually at a very, very high threshold in India.
Right.
When the West talks of tolerance, it is only, okay, we will tolerate them coming and building a mosque, but somewhere far. That's not tolerance. Tolerance is in India is at a very high level. It's defined very differently from tolerance in the rest of the world. So as a result of this, I think what we're going to see more and more in Europe is friction between the minorities.
On the streets.
On the streets, in the workplace, on the streets, somewhat.
Because that's what most of the videos that come out of Europe are from.
The real friction is going to come in the workplace, in society, when interracial marriages start, when parts of cities get ghettoized because, they are where immigrants congregate, where immigrant festivals and customs begin to come into friction with what is the mainstream festival or culture. So these are adjustments we have made a long time back.
Right.
But they are in the stage of still don't know how to handle it.
Right.
So, sir, before you specifically said that the world probably doesn't understand the importance of India's influence on certain matters around the world. One thing I can specifically think of is during COVID, which was called the vaccine Maitri. Can you please just give us some context before we delve further into it? What exactly is that?
Yeah, so I think, this is one core message of India, which is you don't keep everything to yourself. You tend to share, right? And we were the only country to do so. That was the significance of Vaccine Maitri. Distributing vaccines is not a big deal. But distributing vaccines when every country is in crisis, where you have a hard choice between whether you should save your own citizen or some foreign citizen who doesn't owe you loyalty, where every other government prioritized their citizen over the foreign citizen. This government, while keeping its own citizens in mind, also said we will send vaccines to other countries because as a civilization, it behooves us to stand together. The Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam idea, right? Now, this is part of a much greater civilizational ethos that has existed. So, Indian civilization, if you go to Vietnam, Singapore, Malaya, Indonesia, or you go even to Oman or to Iran this way, has never been spread by the sword, right? You have never actually conquered Malaysia or Vietnam or Thailand or Oman or Iran. So how has that influence spread? The influence is essentially spread culturally. In other words, you're willing to showcase your culture elsewhere. You're willing to accept other cultures in because you see the whole world as one civilization. And your culture doesn't stop at your territorial boundary. You as a citizen may stop there. But your culture is something which you allow everybody to partake in. You accept their culture, you think they will accept yours. I think that is what Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam is about. Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam is never about conquest, about physically controlling territory, about one world in a political sense. It was about multiple polities existing, but one world in a human sense, humanistic sense, right? And so it's a humanitarian philosophy, and it is that philosophy which has guided Vaccine Maitri. Vaccine Maitri is what you and the Indian public saw because of a difficult time, but even India giving assistance politically in the 50s and 60s and leading the world's decolonization struggle. That was an example of humanitarianism. Indians didn't say, well, we've got independence from the British. Who cares if the Africans have independence or not? We went and championed the cause of South Africa, of Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe, of many of the African states, of many of the Asian states. We saw that in the 1990s and 2000s when even though we were relatively underdeveloped, we gave money outside our borders.
Right.
We built roads in Nepal, we built bridges in Maldives, we went to Africa and did work. This is all part of that same humanitarianism that exists. It's just that in Vaccine Maitri, we were able to see it because we were all focused on this one thing and we were all desperate for the vaccine and we found our government also sharing it with others. So it came to notice. But it's a consistent tradition in India.
Right. So fast forward to the present. It's probably too soon to ask this question, but I still want to hear your opinion on it. How has the world's perception of India changed after that? Or has it even changed?
I think the world perception of India changed maybe around the year 2000 or 2004 and 5.
Okay.
And we have to first and foremost give credit to our IT professionals, right? This was the time when they established their contact with Silicon Valley. And the flow between India and the United States started, right? And therefore the Indian passport was seen not just as a passport of a poor person, but as the passport of an educated, technologically qualified person who could bring value. So really perception in the West changed essentially because of the Indian techie. The Indian student and the Indian techie, and very often they are synonymous, right? Because the Indian student in the US then became the Indian techie in the US.
Right.
So they realized that the person holding an Indian passport was highly educated, usually in the STEM subjects, and then was technologically innovative.
Right.
And I think first and foremost that changed. And I can say this because as a Indian Foreign Service officer who lived abroad from 1980 onwards, I saw that transition happening. In the 80s and early 90s, I could feel that when I went to an immigration officer in the queue at any airport, they looked on me as a poor developing country representative. I mean, as a citizen.
Right.
Right? When I went after 2000, they looked on me as a sort of aspiring, upwardly mobile citizen. So I think that was the first big change. The second change, I think, was the reforms that P.V. Narasimha Rao government brought in. And I say P.V. Narasimha Rao government very particularly because it is him we must give credit to as the Prime Minister. We give it to Dr. Manmohan Singh, of course, as Finance Minister, but ultimately the Prime Minister is the leader of the nation, and therefore you have to give credit to the leader of the nation, just as the leader of the nation takes the blame also if something goes wrong. Now, because of those economic reforms, the privatization that occurred, the economy began to grow, we allowed foreign goods to come in, and the ambassador and Maruti went by the board because we now have, other cars. We opened our markets. There was a greater understanding of India. A lot more foreigners came to India, particularly to do business. They saw that this was not a basket case, that this was in fact a place which was going to grow and invest in. They spread the word. So a lot of big American and Western corporations went out and told their own people, this is a country which you can do business with, which you need to look for. And then, of course, the current governments, that is Dr. Manmohan Singh's UPA government and then particularly Mr. Modi's government, because our economy has grown and because our confidence has grown, we are able to project ourselves better abroad. And therefore, that has helped India's image in terms of being. Now we are transitioning from not only just being a developing country, we are transitioning to becoming a major power. We are not there, and we will not be there for another 15, 20 years, but we are certainly a middle level power now. So the world has to sit up and take notice of you, simply because you have the means and wherewithal to influence events, certainly in the whole Indian Ocean region, right? Through where most of the world's trade passes.
Right.
You can actually interdict the trade routes now. You can disrupt trade. So people have to take you a bit more seriously, which they are. So, as I said, there's never one reason why perceptions change. It is a continuous series of events which have occurred from the late 1980s. And we have to give credit to every government since the 1980s, starting with Rajiv Gandhi, because some of the technological innovations started from there and continue. So every prime minister, every government has added something. And this government is continuing in that tradition. And I think it's good for the country. I mean, so long as that continues, I think we all benefit, individually and nationally also.
Okay. My next question is, I would say, relevant to my age group, because there's a certain interest that has been going on for a long time now, but I'd say it's at its peak now of people my age going to the United States to study for their higher studies in bachelor's, master's, PhD, whatever. So unfortunately, since January, there has been some news that has led to the deaths of some Indian students around 4 states in the United States. My question is, what is the role of India's foreign ministry to help the parents who lost their kids?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's a good question. First of all, it's very tragic that so many young Indians have lost their lives. And it's important to look at the reasons for it. I'm sure that this is being studied very carefully in India, because any life that is lost abroad has a domestic repercussion as well. But I'm not familiar with the circumstances under which all these deaths took place. So I really can't comment on that aspect of it. But, essentially one of the big achievements of the current government has been to pay greater attention to the requirements of Indian citizens abroad. There's no doubt that the government of Prime Minister Modi has taken enormous steps in this regard, some of which the people don't even know. Certainly the people who are in the upper income bracket. For instance, there's a program that the government has started where each time you make a passport or you give a visa to a foreign country, a tiny amount of money is also charged to you. You probably don't even pay attention to it, which goes into a fund. And that fund is used. There are servants abused or workers abused in the Gulf. There are maids abused in the Gulf. There are people who are hurt in accidents. There are repatriations during crises. Where does the government of India get the money to do all this? It is through this. And this is what the government of India is doing, right? So the point I want to make is the Modi government has actually increased the focus on citizens of India abroad and their requirements and needs. So one of them is students. Students are increasingly a priority for the government of India simply because of the sheer number of students abroad, right? So embassies and consulates have been told to focus on the student community. And if you see in the United States particularly, there's been this unfortunate situation where sometimes Indian students have gone to colleges which don't exist, and later on arrested by the Americans.
Right.
And the Indian embassy has actually intervened and got them released and repatriated them back, right? So student issues are important. So I think the first thing when you need any services in Indian abroad, whether you lost your passport or you're a student in trouble or a student dies or any other circumstance, is to contact the nearest Indian consulate or embassy. And these days it can be done digitally because all Indian embassies have accounts on X, on Instagram, on Facebook, as well as on email, right? And to explain your circumstance. By and large, what the Indian consulate or embassy will do is immediately to get in touch with the police authorities there or the government authorities. And first and foremost, find out what is happening there. Secondly, they will inform the foreign ministry back in Delhi with details to contact the families concerned. And if there are very large mishaps, let's say an airliner crashes, for instance, or an earthquake takes place, immediately a helpline is set up by the External Affairs Ministry. So you can contact a particular telephone number in the foreign ministry, and that foreign ministry is in touch with the embassy. So you're more likely to know about whereabouts of your loved ones quicker than if you were to do it yourself, because you wouldn't know anybody in the United States. Then typically what the embassy would do in the case of a death like this, a student death, is that they would send somebody there and find out what has happened.
Like physically send someone.
Physically send someone. Find out what has happened. Get in touch with the police. Get in touch with legal efforts. Get in touch with the coroner to have the body released, right? Because the family is waiting for the body. In cases where the family cannot afford to repatriate the remains, mortal remains, the embassy and the government of India even take that expense on account, provided you can prove that you are from an income group which cannot allow for repatriation. There are families which say, please cremate or bury the remains there. The Indian embassy takes responsibility for that. There are cases where you don't get visas. Typically, Canada, the United States, very difficult to get a visa. The foreign ministry will intervene to get a visa for the family.
On short notice.
On very short notice. And so on and so forth. So the point is, the embassies now have a wide range of responsibilities and the necessary resources to help. So it is a point of contact which must be immediately activated. I have to say that sadly, the Indian citizens in many countries do not respond the way the government would like them to. For instance, in a number of cases, the government has asked Indian citizens to register with Indian embassies. So the Indian embassy has a basic knowledge. Who are you? What is your contact number or email? Where are you staying? Let's say there's an earthquake. At least you know how many Indian citizens are located in that state of the United States. Well, the US doesn't have earthquakes, but in countries which have, let us say, are prone to disasters. Where are they staying? How are they contacted? Can you form small groups so that messages spread quickly? But Indian citizens don't register. They take it for granted that I don't have any responsibility. But if something happens to me, the state has a responsibility.
Right.
You know, as citizens, there are rights and there are responsibilities. If the government asks Indian citizens staying abroad, not traveling abroad, if you're going for a casual visit, you don't register. But if you're staying, like you are a student staying, the Indian government says, please register with the embassy. And you don't register with the embassy, then you are actually, in a sense, hampering the work of the government itself. Because the government's intention is not to collect any information on you. It is basically in a crisis to know what is the scale of the problem they're dealing with. Are there 10 Indian citizens who are likely to be in need of medical help or eradication, or 100,000? And that you can only know if you have data, right? So, I would also appeal through your own podcast to Indian students and families of Indian students. Please register with Indian embassies and consulates. And not just families of Indian students, even families staying in India who have members of their families who are residing in the United States, working in the United States, not just studying there, please register with Indian embassies and consulates in all countries abroad. Give them the data with which to work in case an emergency occurs. And that can be a personal emergency, it can be a larger scale emergency.
So I'd just like to interject over here for the benefit of our viewers and Indians at large. What's the easiest and what's the way to register with the embassies when they're studying or living abroad?
All Indian embassies and consulates have a website, and on the website you will find a link for registration of what is called non-resident Indians, which is all Indian citizens living abroad are known as NRIs.
Right.
The difference between NRI and PIO is that the person of Indian origin is of Indian origin holding a foreign passport. The NRI is an Indian citizen living abroad. So for
Holding an Indian passport.
And holding an Indian passport. So for all NRIs, there is a point, a link on every embassy website and consulate where you can register. If, for instance, it is not there, the Indian embassy website will still have an email link saying contact us. You can register there as well and ask what is the procedure to register as an Indian citizen with that embassy. It's a fairly simple procedure, and there's no complication involved.
And it's non-intrusive.
It is completely non-intrusive. It doesn't ask you, they're not interested in where you're working and how much you're earning and so on. They just need details which will be useful to them in terms of a crisis, or in case they need to contact you, which are essentially your contact details which we ordinarily give everybody in India as well.
Right.
Your mobile phone number, your email number, your name,
details.
members of your family who are staying with you, other Indian citizens staying with you, your passport details, maybe your next of kin in case they need to inform, in the case of some unfortunate development, they need to inform relatives. Nothing more than that.
All right.
And the advantage also, I might add, of registering is you get updates and information. If there are changes in the Passport Act, if there are changes in the Visa Act, if there are changes of rules in apostilling documents, so that which you need if you are applying in foreign universities or work visas, for instance, or if the visa fee changes. Or even general announcements, announcements of cultural programs the embassy is holding, or maybe the Prime Minister is visiting, and they say any Indian citizen may want to come and attend the gathering. That sort of information you also get once you come on the contact list.
Right. Wonderful.
Since we're talking about students, I would also like to know a little bit about careers along the lines of what you're doing. What is your advice to the young person who's sort of an aspirant to work within the government of India? What is your advice to that person?
It's a very fulfilling job, but we have to understand it is not a career. It is public service. A career is one where you better yourself for either status or money. Public service has neither. You certainly don't have money, because a person who actually qualifies for the UPSC can probably quite easily get a job in the private sector for at least 10 to 15 times what she or he is earning. And secondly, you don't have status in the sense that it is a hierarchy-based organization where maybe at the end of 15, 30 years, you might have some status, but it's not like the private sector, or it's not like other professions, medical, legal, engineering, where you achieve a certain status because you have certain achievements to your credit. It's a public service. That means you are there 24/7. You can't say it's 5 o'clock, my work ends, or that it's a Saturday or Sunday, my work ends. In Indian embassies and consulates abroad, and that is true whether you're a district magistrate, a superintendent of police, an income tax officer, or anything, if you are contacted after office hours or on holidays, you have to work, right? So you have to be prepared to make that sacrifice. Thirdly, your own postings and your own place of stay is not determined by you. If you are in the private sector or you have a profession, that choice at least is with you. You say, I will not work because my company is posting me here. I will therefore choose to leave the company and find work in my area. You don't have that privilege in government unless you want to resign from government service. The government tells you you have to go to Baghdad, you go to Baghdad to serve in the embassy. The government tells you, you go to a disturbed Naxali area in Chhattisgarh, you go to the disturbed Naxali area to serve. So and that involves huge sacrifices for the families, right? Because education systems are not there. In the case of the foreign service, the family support system is not there. You're living abroad in a foreign country. You have no relative near you. You can't, if you need...
You're all on your own.
Yeah, you and your immediate spouse and child or children. Beyond that, no greater family is there, right? If you go to a difficult posting in India, like a superintendent of police, a police officer or a government servant does, again, you're in a remote place. Sometimes connectivity is poor, education is poor, medical facilities are poor, but you have got to do it. So you have to make certain sacrifices. But if you're willing to make those sacrifices, I think this is a very noble profession, because the kind of experience you get as a district magistrate or a superintendent of police, which is in the age bracket of 30 to 35, you are administering at least 2 to 5 million people. No, even, let me put it this way, even Mr. Mukesh Ambani and Mr. Gautam Adani don't control that number of people today. The depth of experience you get, the kind of problems you see, from dealing with malnutrition or disease at one end to building the Atal Setu on the other, which is a highly complicated engineering feat, right, is all done in a district by the district officers. Where do you get that experience? So it's a very fulfilling career that way. In any profession you take, whether you're an income tax officer or a IAS officer or a police officer or a railway officer, that's an enormous experience. And of course, one other thing I might add, supposing you feel in 15 or 18 or 20 years, it's not fulfilling for you, and that's entirely possible. Any private sector company will snap you up, because let's say, I know that your dad has a logistics company. When you're in the Indian Railways and you're moving millions of tons of goods a day, why would anybody in the logistics sector not want to employ you?
Right.
You have the domain knowledge to manage a complicated exercise where millions of containers are moving a day. You have you know the computer systems that function, you know the on-ground systems that function. You've dealt with all sorts of problems, from floods to some missing, wagon has not been coupled to another one. Anybody will employ you. And that goes of practically any work you do in government, because the scale and scope of this is such that you will never get it in any other profession.
I never looked at it that way.
So I think overall it's a very fulfilling profession, but it's a public service.
Right.
If you want to be comfortable, if you want to end work at 5 o'clock, if your priority is something other than public service, then my advice is don't join the government, because you will be miserable there.
Okay. The selection process, sir, to become a government servant, IFS, ILS, IPS, etc. They generally, we keep hearing that, kids who are getting into these exams of UPSC, etc. and all that, it's a very strenuous process, and the attrition rate is very high. And of late, we've been reading that, a lot of kids are committing suicide. They can't handle the pressure of the exams. They get a number of attempts, and on the final attempt, if they still don't make it, they write letters to their parents that say, I'm sorry, I couldn't do this, and I'm taking my life. Do you feel that there is a need of change somewhere in this kind of process to try and select the best?
It's a competitive process. And if you talk of suicides and distress, it is there whether you're applying for the IIT-JEE exam, for the NEET exam, or for any other job in India. And that's because we are a highly populous country with more people than jobs. Right? So you're going to have to compete everywhere. And this is no less than, or no more than, let us say, competing for a university, a place in the university, or a job in a company.
Right.
The only difference is this is a very transparent and fair process. You can't buy your way into the Union Public Service Commission, and there's no way you can cheat your way in that exam. At least up to now, nobody has discovered that. So and the requirements are fair across the board. You just have to be a graduate. You can be a graduate of aeronautical engineering at one end or a graduate in Sanskrit studies at the other. Ultimately, it's a level playing field.
Right.
And you have to have good general knowledge, or knowledge of general, general awareness has to be good.
Right.
So it's a transparent process. The selection in services is merit cum preference. So, and they declare the number of slots every year, 100 for the IAS, 20 for the foreign service. Then depending on where you come on the merit list, you can select it. So to that extent, I think it's a very fair and transparent system. Like any competitive exam, hopefully you get the best of the best.
Right.
That's not always the case in reality, but that's true of every profession.
Absolutely.
And so I think that, no, I don't think you need to bring any fundamental reform in the system. What I think you do need to do is introduce a secondary examination at the senior level. My only suggestion is, at the moment, if you pass the examination, for the next 30 years, you're not tested again. But all of us evolve, and some of us get better and some of us fall behind.
Or stagnate.
Surely there should, after 20 years of service, be another examination which determines whether you're fit for promotion to the highest ranks of the government services or not. And that perhaps should be introduced to remove complacency also, that once you're there, then you're there for life and nobody can move you out. Because the privilege you have in the government is you're protected by Article 311 and 312 of the Constitution, which means that nobody can remove you from public service. Unless, of course, there's a legal case, criminal case, or you are impeached in Parliament. But merely because you say no to a minister, or you object to a certain policy within rational thing, you can't be removed from office. You're protected. So that's a big thing.
Right.
But that should not be used. Job security should not be used to not work, or to stagnate, or to fall behind. So my recommendation, I think, is that there should be an examination in mid-career to determine whether you should go to the senior position.
I think that's a very, very valid point. Very valid point.
So my next question is a little bit about your personal opinion on learning. Since you are a writer, and I presume that you also read a lot, my question is that, do you think my current generation would learn more from podcasts like this than from books?
No, I think both are important. But what I do feel is that the current generation seems to be learning things more from X and Instagram and Facebook.
Right.
And that's worrying, because these are sound bites. Sound bites can give you impressions. They can't give you deep knowledge. Deep knowledge comes from two ways. Either you'll hear somebody else who is knowledgeable, and that's the podcast. And not all podcasts, right?
Yeah.
Podcasts which there are some podcasts and then there are other podcasts. But hearing is one way, right? And that is actually the Indian tradition. Indian tradition was Shruti, right? All knowledge was received from the ear. Right? The other way is the Western tradition, which is knowledge is received from books, which is the written word. Which of course now is there in India because we've translated all our Shruti into written words. But that was not the Indian way. The Indian way was actually Shruti, which is podcast. The Western way is writing, right? Which is books. But both are necessary. And I feel that we are seriously losing the ability to gain deep knowledge on any subject, because reading as a habit is fallen. And that's okay if people don't want to buy physical books. But surely we can do e-reading. And even hearing, we would rather hear in short, small sound bites, or when we are stuck in a traffic jam, or when we are waiting at the airport, rather than a long program of 1 to 2 hours where we actually get knowledge. So I would say that if we are in a digital world, then the inevitability of the podcast cannot be ignored. But at least then our younger generation should listen to informed podcasts on subjects rather than small tweets on X or sound bites on
reels on
Instagram,
etc.
Yes.
Right. So about the UN Security Council, I just wanted your view on, where is India? What is our stand here? There's a lot of talk on this going on since many years that, should we be on it? Should we not? Why were we not offered it earlier? Why are we being offered it now? What's your take on this? Where are we here?
Yeah, well, I think it's very clear that India has to be a permanent member of the Security Council. And it has been the view of every government since independence that we should be on that. It is a quirk of history that we are not a permanent member of the Security Council, because in 1945 we were not independent. But we were on the winning side, and more Indians died in the war fighting. I'm not saying being killed by enemy bombs, fighting for victory, than Chinese died, for instance. A lot more Chinese died because the Japanese simply bombed Chinese cities, but that's not fighting. Fighting is when you volunteer to go and beat the enemy. A lot more Indians, undivided India, no doubt, but Indians died. Had we been independent, we would have been a permanent member of the Security Council because we were on the winning side. Because we were not independent and they needed an Asian country and Japan had been defeated, China became member of the Security Council. So it was a historical anomaly. Now, forget what happened in the past because that's in the past. But today, in the 21st century, which we think is going to be more democratic, by any standard, we have to be there. We are the world's most populous country. So even in the numbers game, elections are a numbers game, population matters, right? So you have to be on the Security Council. Territorially, 7th largest country in the world. You have to be on the Security Council. Economically, we are already the 5th largest and there are 5 members. We are going to be the 3rd largest. You have to be on the Security Council. In terms of science, technology, innovation, startups, among the top 10 countries in the world. Militarily, the 4th most powerful nation in the world. Contribution to UN peacekeeping, the 2nd largest. So by any parameter, objectively speaking, not because I'm Indian, right? Even if I was a foreigner, if you look at the objective parameters, you tick every single box. So how can you have credibility in the world if a country like India is missing from the UN Security Council? And the problem today is the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the Israel-Hamas conflict are not being solved by the Security Council because it has lost credibility. Countries which have very little role to play, like the Europeans are there, whereas larger countries which have greater influence like India or Brazil, for instance.
Are being sidelined.
Or Egypt, are not there. So our voice is not heard, but our voice outside is speaking differently. And many more people are giving credibility to our voice than the Security Council. So I think there is a need. But the thing is, whether you're a group of countries or a political group or a group of investors, you don't want any new person coming in, right?
Right.
You shut the door because you preserve your own case and somebody else has to force the door open. That will happen.
Okay.
We don't know when.
Wonderful, wonderful. So another question is that, India has neighbors like China, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Tibet, etc., Nepal. Who's a threat to us? What's your take on that? Who's the biggest threat to us?
No, nobody is a threat to us. We are too big to be threatened by anybody. I think that, for too long we obsessed with Pakistan. What is Pakistan? It's a relatively smaller country with an economy 1/10 our size and has barely been able to maintain unity in the last 75 years. So we should not waste our breath on Pakistan. Our neighborhood is important for our own security.
Absolutely.
And for that, you have to ensure that a bigger thy neighbor policy does not work. If your neighbor is prosperous, then you become even more prosperous simply because your size determines that. If you try to beggar your neighbor, then the neighbor will turn and hurt you. And even if they are not able to hurt you on a large scale, if 6 or 7 of your neighbors all want to hurt you, then it begins to pain. So I think what we are seeing over the last 20-25 years certainly is that we have changed our policy to say prosper thy neighbor. And part of our whole, whether it's vaccine Maitri or whether it is economic development assistance or whether it is assistance in helping prop up democracies, it is that concept, which is if the neighbor feels secure, then you have a better chance of success. Now, at the end of it, you have to say a smaller neighbor will never feel fully secure against a bigger neighbor, right? That's true in business. A small company always fears reliance. Yeah. That is true in politics. A small party always thinks the big party is going to gobble it up. So I think we should also rid ourselves of the idealistic notion that, and I think the government is very clear, but the public, that Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam doesn't mean that because you love every neighbor is going to love you. A smaller neighbor will still feel threatened. But if you act in a relatively open-handed and fair manner, you reduce the level of threat and you increase the level of convergence. And that's all you want, right? But I don't think we are threatened by any neighbor.
Okay. So what's the deal?
Unless you consider China a neighbor, and that is a much bigger country than us. And yes, that is, they are an adversary. And I think the government is quite clearly undertaking various policies to deal with that.
Right. So of late, there's been a lot of news about Kachivaru, the island. What is your take on that? Like, what is the issue there exactly?
No, Kachativu Island, I must admit,
Sorry,
I haven't studied it in any great detail. So my knowledge may be a little dated. But my understanding is this was an island which was in dispute between India and Sri Lanka. In other words, Sri Lanka claimed an island which was administered by us.
Okay.
And on the basis of certain historical and other documents, it was decided by the government of India, I think in 1974, to accept that this was an island that belonged to Sri Lanka.
Okay.
Now, this has always been a sensitive issue in the state of Tamil Nadu. The island lies off the coast of Tamil Nadu, in that the state felt that it was not consulted, perhaps not consulted in this decision. I don't know all the facts in the matter. But it has been a sore point from then and has been raised from time to time, including recently. So, legally speaking, in terms of international law, we have given the island to Sri Lanka and it is now Sri Lankan territory. What the debate is domestically, of course, is another matter. And I don't want to comment on that.
Right.
But domestically, there is now a debate as to whether we should have ceded that territory without consulting the state government concerned. The federal government, in any case, it went through parliament. But should we not have consulted the state?
Because they are affected, logistically, locally over there.
Yes. And for instance, if you see the land border agreement with Bangladesh, West Bengal was consulted before the lands were exchanged between West Bengal and Bangladesh, as a result of which one of the big achievements of the current government was we now have a totally settled land boundary with Bangladesh. Now, I'm not saying that there are equivalencies here, but I'm just saying that this is the debate.
Right. So I have another question. Generally, whenever there's an election in India, irrespective of the political party in power or going to be coming into power, there are a lot of stinging articles by certain newspapers in the West, like, New York, NYT, WAPO, etc. And off late, and a lot of those news articles are very misleading or full of misinformation and very biased. What does our foreign affairs ministry do in such cases? Do they do something, or do they just sit back and, not interfere? Like a seasoned diplomat like yourself, would you be called in to quell the situation or to try and, make them, be the voice of reason from our side?
Yeah, so all Indian embassies and consulates are in regular touch with most of these international publications, right? So our embassy in Washington would be in regular touch with New York Times, Washington Post, in France with Le Monde, in Britain with the Financial Times and the Financial Times and so on. That's a regular part of an embassy's functioning. You have to maintain contact with the media and educate them on what India's perspective is, right? We represent the government of India. But that does not mean that they publish the facts. The newspaper also has a policy and an agenda.
Right.
And very often we know that agenda. Right? And very often that agenda is mixed with a sense of patronizing attitude towards what they see as poor, developing, quote unquote, backward countries. Because that makes news. It's much more interesting to read that 25 people have died because of some unknown disease in India than the fact that 5,000 people have prospered because a startup has gone, a startup which only India could do has gone, or a rocket has been launched by a startup. That's not news for them. They don't want to know that. They only want to reinforce their bias that India is a backward, underdeveloped country. I think the best message has been given by the Indian public, right?
Right.
I mean, the vote itself has proved to the West that democracy is not only alive and kicking, but it is fair and it is a fair process, despite everything that the West said about the EVMs not
Intolerance,
functioning.
intolerance
No,
growing.
forget intolerance. The EVMs not functioning, the government rigging the polls, the authoritarian style of
Petty rumors,
the current
basically.
prime minister.
Democracy
Yes,
is
despite
dead.
that, how do you explain that the so-called rigging of EVMs and authoritarian prime minister could not even get 272? I mean, so you've answered the West. Does that mean they're going to change? They're not going to change. The Western agenda is essentially to keep rising powers down. And I don't blame them. We would do the same if we were in the West. And part of the instrument they have is public opinion. They control the world's media.
But
Right?
would we, sir, would we do the same? Because given our history
See,
of,
that's a hypothetical question I can't answer, but real politics drives foreign policy, not idealism. And real politics demands that when you're on the top, you keep competition down. That's true of politics, is true of business, it's also true of international relations. So while I can't answer your hypothetical question, if I were there, theoretically, and we were on the top, yes, I would use my media to keep somebody else down. Why wouldn't I? Why would I not? Why would I give them a chance to rise and compete with me?
Right.
So we have to accept that the New York Times or the Washington Post is not going to be favorable to you. We have to go on plugging our line with them, but we don't have to get influenced by them. We have to prove by our actions that we are not what they say we are. And I think
unless an Indian media house buys them out.
no, that's no, but there's, I think, some, unless an Indian media house buys them out, but I think they can't buy us out, fortunately, because FDI does not allow a majority
Right.
ownership of Indian media
Right,
at the
right,
moment, at least.
Right. Well, I think this has been a wonderful episode where I've learned a lot, and I think India is rising in foreign stature or in international stature thanks to wonderful diplomats and bureaucrats like Sir. And I think my takeaway from this message, from this episode, is most importantly, that when we Indians are traveling abroad, we must register with our embassies, especially if you're working or studying there. Because let the embassy know that you're there so that they can help you in times of crisis, in terms of, any natural calamities or, any cross-border situations, etc. like that. I think that's my takeaway from this episode. And Sir, I really, I'm grateful to you for coming here and sparing time from your busy schedule. Thank you very much.